Welcome to another episode of Brainjo Bites. So I received a number of questions in response to the last episode, which was all about the importance of your learning path in determining your success. If you haven't listened to that episode, I'll put a link in the notes. You might want to go back and listen to it first, but you don't have to. But in that episode, I talked about how the path that we take in learning is the critical determinant of our success. And in that episode, I made the analogy to learning to play the banjo, specifically learning three-finger style, where the approach of learning rolls in the beginning as kind of a foundational element sets people up for frustration and failure down the road. So rolls, for those of you who don't know, are these picking patterns. And again, it's because of the kind of neural networks that are created by that learning process, just like the learning process that made it difficult for kids down the road in progressing in their reading. So as I said, I received several questions after that episode, most of them along the lines of, if this is true, then how do you learn those rolls or those picking patterns, which we are told are sort of iconic or essential elements of three-finger style banjo. So the question is, if I want those picking patterns in my playing, how should I go about learning them? And that's the question I'm going to answer in this episode. And in a minute, I'll give a few examples on the banjo to illustrate the concepts here. The simplest answer to that question, which I touched on in the last episode, is that rolls are an emergent property of learning the fundamental elements of fingerstyle banjo. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Let's first consider the example of talking, or how we learn to talk. As I've said before, the single best example we have for an ideal or optimal learning process is how we all learn language or learn to talk. Talking is as advanced a cognitive function as anything any human will ever do, and the success rate in learning it is extraordinarily high. The reason it's so high is because the learning process for it is baked into our DNA. So it is the perfect model for how to learn anything, as that process itself has been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. And the language learning process also happens to translate particularly well to learning music, because talking and playing music are such similar things. Now, with that in mind, let me ask you a question. How did you learn sentences? Now, you speak in sentences each and every day, every time you carry out a conversation. But when you're thinking of what to say, do you do so by thinking through a catalog of possible sentences that you've memorized, and then you select one from that set of possibilities? Of course not, right? What do you do? Well, you first start with an idea, and that idea is the thing that you want to communicate to someone else. And then you select the words that you need to communicate that idea, and then you combine those words together in the right sequence, using a set of rules about how to combine words together to end up with a sentence that can convey that thought in your head into someone else's head. Now, all that stuff happens in a flash because your brain is so good at talking. But you can imagine someone trying to reverse engineer that process, seeing language being these wall-to-wall sentences, mistakenly thinking that you learn to talk by memorizing those sentences. Sentences are one of any number of patterns that you could find in spoken language, but the point is that these patterns are emerging from this particular process of assembling the basic building blocks of language together according to a set of rules in order to communicate an idea that's in your mind. But even though you can find any number of patterns in language, including sentences, you're not talking by explicitly choosing those patterns. Rather, they're a byproduct of this process that everybody uses when they talk. So now let's apply this same process to playing music, or the ideal way to play music. So it should begin with an idea in mind, so something in mental space that we want to communicate, right? In this case, it's some chunk of music or a string of sounds, right? And then we select the elements that we need to get that idea out of our head and into the world through our instrument. And we do so using the fundamental building blocks of music, along with the rules for how to assemble those building blocks together that are going to depend somewhat on our instrument and our style. So for something like three-finger banjo, just a single line of music contains melody notes, drone notes, and harmony notes. And those are all assembled together according to certain rules we've learned for how to put those together. Namely, to try to fill in all of the spaces between the melody notes, and for fingerstyle banjo to try not to play notes on the same string twice. So again, we begin with melody, harmony, and rhythm in our mind that we want to convey, and then we assemble our building blocks together according to certain rules. And notably with fingerstyle banjo, we're trying not to pick the same string twice in a row. Okay, so now I'm just going to demonstrate this process on the banjo, and I'm going to use the beginning phrase from the song Grandfather's Clock, which goes, "My grandfather's clock was too tall for the shelf." Okay, so I'm starting with that particular idea in my mind, right? I have a melody and a rhythm, and I'm going to try to turn that into three-finger banjo arrangement. So if we just play that basic melody and rhythm, we'd have... My grandfather's clock was too tall for the shelf. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in the spaces in that melody with other notes on the banjo, with harmony notes and melody notes. And if we want to fill in with harmony notes, then we also need to know the chords. So essentially I'm taking that basic foundation, applying the rules of the style to combine all these elements together, and this is what I would get. All right, now let's say I want to do it slightly differently. I want to apply a different rhythm there. So in this case, I'd like to sound like, "My grandfather's clock was too tall for the shelf." All right, so finding those notes in that rhythm would be... My grandfather's clock was too tall for the shelf. And then if I turn that into a three-finger arrangement using those same rules, then it would sound like this. Or as a third alternative, maybe I want it to sound like this. My grandfather's clock was too tall for the shelf. Again, that way, the way before, two different ways of kind of syncopating the melody. So that would sound like this. Okay, and again, applying the rules to turn it into a three-finger arrangement, I get this. So again, I'm starting with a particular idea, a musical idea in my mind that I'm trying to create, and then I'm taking the core elements of this particular style, assembling them together in a way that matches that sound. So now let's take a look at what the tab would look like for those three different versions of this beginning phrase from Grandfather's Clock. And lo and behold, what do we see? There are patterns everywhere. Not just any patterns, but classic banjo rolls. Again, these patterns are there in the music, but those patterns emerge from that particular process that I talked about earlier. They emerge from this process of, number one, having an idea in mind of what sound I wanted to make, and then using the fundamental elements and rules of fingerstyle banjo to turn that into a three-finger banjo arrangement. So the concept of rolls originally came up from trying to reverse engineer three-finger banjo. So just if you were going to reverse engineer those three examples that I gave, you find those patterns everywhere. And again, we'll find all sorts of patterns in any music we find, regardless of whether the performer playing that music was explicitly trying to create those patterns or not, right? They're going to emerge from this particular process that someone is using to create music. Earl Scruggs himself has said that he did not think in terms of rolls. His main objective was to keep a continuous stream of notes going on the banjo and weave in the melody into that. And he clearly enjoyed syncopation, so he often syncopated the melody. And those particular preferences and that desire for that continuous stream of notes led to particular patterns in his playing. But those patterns were a byproduct. Some of you listening may recall the first law of Brainjo, which is to learn to play like the masters, learn to play like the masters. And again, that's emphasizing the critical importance of the learning process or the path that we take in learning, because it's the path we take that determines the kind of neural machinery that we build that allows us to play music. And one great place to look for guidance on what that path should look like is to the people who have reached a certain level of expertise or who play in ways that we would like to emulate, and then to specifically look at the learning path they took in getting there. If there's anything we want to reverse engineer, it's their learning process. All right, thanks to all of you who submitted questions after the last episode. I do read all of the comments and emails that I receive, and as you can tell, they will sometimes serve as topics for future episodes. That is all for this Brainjo Bite. Thank you for watching or listening, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching this episode of Brainjo Bites. To catch future episodes, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you haven't done so already. You can also hear these episodes on the Brainjo Jam podcast, and you'll find a link to that in the video description. Also, if you are ready to get started learning the banjo, then head over to brainjo.academy. There you will find courses based on the Brainjo method, the first neuroscience-based system of instruction designed specifically for grown-up brains, with no prior musical experience required.